It looks like we're at the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Samantha Oakley. I'm with ALA's Public Programs Office. I'm pleased to introduce today's webinar, Media Literacy for Adults, Media Landscape and Economics. Next slide, please. Before we start, I'd like to make a couple of quick notes about our virtual classroom. Only our presenters have microphone access, but you are welcome to type your questions in the Q&A box. To send a question, move your cursor towards the bottom of the Zoom window and click Q&A. Please also use the Q&A window to communicate any technical issues with ALA staff. Please do not put technical questions in the chat as they could be easily missed if that window is very busy. We respond to your questions as quickly as possible. Note that this session will be recorded, so if you would like to review any information, you may do so via the archived version that we will send out within 48 hours of this session. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is presented by ALA's Public Programs Office as part of the Media Literacy Education in Libraries for Adult Audiences project, which is made possible in part by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this webinar do not necessarily represent those of the Institute of Museum and Library Services or of ALA. Next slide, please. As information providers and hubs for lifelong learning, libraries have always been resources for helping communities develop media literacy skills. Now, in the midst of a global pandemic and in an age when we increasingly rely on digital media for information and communication, these critical thinking skills are more important than ever. The Media Literacy Education in Libraries for Adult Audiences project is designed to support libraries in their efforts to improve the media literacy skills of adults in our communities. By tapping the expertise of a diverse group of 30 thought leaders, this project has created a suite of free media literacy resources, including a practitioner's guide and series of 6 webinars. In this webinar, which is the 5th in the series, Michael Spikes will be discussing the current media landscape, how to differentiate between different types of online media, and what techniques you can use for discerning their credibility. Next slide, please. Michael has been teaching, writing about, and developing curriculum on the subject of news media literacy and its production for more than 15 years. Currently, he is a PhD candidate at Northwestern University's School of Education and Social Policy, studying theories of the learning sciences for application to news media literacy education. Michael's previous positions include project director for the Center for News Literacy at Stony Brook University, media studies and production and structure in public and charter schools in Washington, D.C., and educational advisory team member at the Newseum. He also held a role as a radio producer and youth trainer for NPR, and he is currently the producer for the Kellogg Insight podcast at Northwestern University. Michael continues to work as a speaker and practitioner in the field through Mass Media Consulting, LLC. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Michael.
So good afternoon, everybody. I want to first thank all of you who have taken out the time to join us today. And I also want to thank the folks in the programming office at ALA for having me as part of this project. Libraries have played such a huge role in my life and my career, and it's a real joy to be able to continue this kind of work and looking at this with other librarians and other library workers from not only in my local area, but also around the country. So I really want to thank all of you for that. So as you heard, I'm Mike Spikes, and I'm going to be talking with you today a little bit about the current landscape of media, and also take you through a part of a lesson that comes from the Center for News Literacy, my previous employer, that helps to frame some of the ideas about our current media landscape, which can be kind of messy. And we'll also use a tool that allows us to draw distinctions between different types of media. We can also think of these as media genres. And by that, what I mean is being able to discern between items such as entertainment or news content, being that we can look for certain characteristics within those different genres. So before I get started, I want to give you some quick background on me, just to contextualize my connection to ALA and with libraries. So first, I want to tell you that while my professional career has been set in education, it's also been in media as well. And my first job in education started in this place right here. And it was funny thinking about it that 17 years ago, I started off as an elementary. Now, the job title at that time was media specialist, but I was the elementary school librarian in Ohio. And although the media part of that job was what got me to apply for it, it was working with the young people in the school that really got me interested in teaching and really following this path of education. And after that, as you heard, then I spent 7 years in the Washington, D.C. public schools and public charter schools where I was a media studies and production teacher. And in lots of those classes, I started utilizing lessons that were part of a college level course that came out of Stony Brook University, which is where the Center for News Literacy is based. And I started using those in my classes. And then later, I joined the center as a team member to help develop curriculum tools and also digital resources and a digital resource center that helped easily distribute the tools that they used as part of their course to help others look at and learn and also teach others how to use these tools for discerning credibility and reliability of information using the framework of journalism. Then that work took me to the Chicago area, which I am at now, where, funny enough, a comment that I posted on a story about the use of media literacy in libraries led to there being a connection with the programming office at the American Library Association, where we developed a prototype project back in 2017, which turned into media literacy at your library. And this webinar continues parts of that project where we look at developing and giving training in media literacy to librarians and other library workers to work with adult populations and to work with them on these sort of issues to help them discern reliable information online. So where I'm going to start, so from that gives you a little bit of background on where we've come from, where I've gotten to here, and also that this particular webinar, and if you follow some of the previous ones, they've been based on the work that's been put into a practitioner's guide in which a number of other experts, along with myself in media literacy, have written up and looked at ways that librarians can be using some of the tools that we use as part of media literacy in their library. So this is somewhat based on that particular section. So where I'm going to start with also is where almost all news literacy classes start, with the challenges that face today's information consumer. So first, we start off with this. We have 4 challenges in total, with the first being speed versus accuracy. These days, we've gotten so used to the ubiquity of finding information that we need and how quickly we can do so. We sometimes get into this dichotomy between knowing that it takes time for us to make sure that information is accurate, but that then clashes with how fast we want that information. So lots of times we've seen examples where information will come out really, really quickly, but later we find out that it might not have been as accurate. Secondly, that there's just way too much information. So this is best illustrated by the image that's to the left here, where some have referred to finding information on the internet like drinking from a fire hose, where there's just way too much information. And ironically, lots of times what we find is that while we have so much more access to much more information in ways that make it easy for us to find information in our own homes or in our pockets, that we almost seem to be even less informed than we need to be. Because what tends to happen is when we are encountering way too many choices of information, we tend to shut down those parts of our brains that help us to discern whether or not a piece of information is credible or reliable. Third is this idea about the disintermediation of media. And what that means is that platforms these days, especially social media, have allowed us to go from to create direct contact between media creators and media consumers, meaning that there's very little human mediation that gets in the middle of that helps that media that gets created to make sure that it is reliable before it gets to the consumer. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and give you a more precise definition later in this presentation. But this has also led to somewhat of a blurring of lines between categories. You recall I talked about that at the very beginning, and that's going to be our focus here, where we see where the lines between different media types or media genres can get blurred in places like social media. And then fourth, the big challenge is that we have to overcome our own dispositions when coming towards certain pieces of media, and they sort of direct the ways that we might react to certain pieces of media, or what pieces of information we choose to take up and which we don't. So those are the four big challenges that we sort of frame in news literacy when we talk about the challenges that are in front of today's consumer. And today, what we're going to focus on is that on disintermediation and this blurring of the lines. This is best illustrated by this example of two Facebook posts, where the one on the left shows a news story that talks about the breeding of a habanero pepper that has all the flavor of the pepper, but no heat. And if you're someone like me who does not like spicy food, you might really like that. Compared to the one on the right, that comes from what looks like in the image could be a news source. And if you live in a place like Orlando, you might say, oh, I recognize these people on my local news stations, but this is actually an ad. But you see how close and how similar both of these posts look. And when you're sort of engaged in a practice where you just sort of scroll and browse information on a cell phone, it can be difficult to find those markers, such as it being marked as being sponsored, in those posts that make distinctions between the two. So again, the objectives for this presentation include this differentiating between media genres, identifying when the lines get blurry between both of them, and we're going to look at some strategies for determining credible and reliable sources of information. Again, because this comes from news literacy lessons, we're going to look at and use the frame of journalism. So as we get started, we're going to do a little bit of interactivity here on a couple of slides. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you're at your computer watching this, I'm going to ask you to open up a web browser window to get ready to get a link to go to, because I'm going to have you talk back to me as we get started in this presentation. You could also use your cell phone as well. So what we're going to start off with is talking about, again, this idea of our media landscape. And one of the things that we've seen is that the ways in which we find, consume, and share information has shifted a lot. The variety of sources we're confronted with continue to evolve and grow on almost a daily basis. So here's the first question I would like to ask of you. What are some of your primary sources of information? So to respond to this question, you're going to go to the website menti, menti.com, and you'll see that has just popped up in the chat. And when you get to menti.com, it's going to prompt you for a code, and the code you're going to use is 4733983 to respond to this question. You can give three primary sources, and in this case, when I'm talking about sources of information, I'm talking about information that you use to make decisions. So those could be a number of different things. So I want you we're going to take about a minute to collect those responses, and we're going to see them in the form of a word cloud. I'm going to leave this up for a couple of extra seconds here, and then I'll bring up the word cloud, and we'll use some music to denote this 1 minute time limit. Okay, there's our minute, and I'm sure that our word cloud here will continue to evolve, just like I talked about those sources of information. So we see that some of the most prominent ones that come up here: New York Times, local newspapers, library databases. We hope to see that from a group of librarians, Wikipedia, social media, Google, Facebook. So you see that there's a number of places that we can go to get lots of different kinds of information these days. So how do we discern and how do we make choices based off of those different sources? So, first off, one of the things we're going to talk about here is that the landscape of media, like we just saw in that word cloud, is expanding in terms of the number of platforms that we can use to get information and to share information. But in some cases, this is also contracting. So, what this image represents on the outside are all of the different communication needs that get satisfied by some of the tools that we can use online. Now we see some of those being publishing, networking, discussing, messaging, and so on. The platforms in the middle, we see Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Sort of their tools allow us to overlap lots of those communication needs. So lots of people, but a lot of these other ones also do some overlapping in terms of those needs. So coming back to this idea of expansion, what I mean by that is that the internet and other recent technological tools have enabled more voices to be part of our current media landscape. You know, we always hear about we've gone from the 3 broadcast channels now to millions and millions of them that are out there. And sometimes I would like to emphasize here too, in using this term media landscape, and sometimes you might also hear of this called the media ecosystem, which these can be really individualized for users, especially on social media. These kinds of phrases are sometimes more helpful to use than just saying, quote unquote, the media, right? Because it encompasses lots of different players and it can be, again, very unique to every individual. So some people, as we saw, might use the New York Times as a primary source of information, while others use Facebook or use their local newspapers as their primary source of information. So those landscapes can be very different. So consider this as well. If you post content to social media, you've gone from being a media consumer to a media creator and almost a publisher. So it's good to keep these things in mind when thinking about the current landscape of media that's out there. So in terms of all of the creators that are out there, the marketplace has just exploded and it's offered everyone a bit of space to put their voices out there. And there's consequences, both good and bad, of that. So one of the other parts of this I talked about was that while the internet has allowed our media landscape to expand, in terms of professional media creators, this landscape has contracted a bit, meaning, and when I talk about these professional creators, I talk about people who work within the media industry, and these include producers, directors, and so on. And we've seen this through a few trends within the media industry. The largest of them, however, has been the ongoing consolidation of media companies into larger conglomerates. And they do this in order to maintain their market placement and also the means for generating profits. So as an example here, we see in this chart that around 1983, more than 50 companies controlled more than 80% of the creation and control of American mass media. But today, that story is much different. As you see, that trend line has been going down and down, where now today, only about 5 companies control, which is now 90% of the media creation and control in the United States. And those 5 companies include AT&T Warner Media, Disney, Comcast, Viacom CBS, and Fox. And you can see here that some of these companies have come together by merging together multiple other companies. So you'll see Comcast now has the Peacock streaming service. They also own Universal Studios, along with also owning the NBC broadcast network. And so this trend is creating some concern. Some of those include the biggest of this is that some of these largest players, in terms of their media caps, not only control the means of production, but also control the distribution channels, such as AT&T with its ownership of Time Warner. It now controls both ends of that calculation. Comcast the same, where it can hold up its own streaming platforms and make them more salient for those who subscribe to their particular means of distribution, meaning Comcast, like its cable services, AT&T, its cable, mobile, and internet services. This has also led to some criticism also that media production companies may be more loyal to its sponsors rather than to its audience. And with less competition being out there, more content that's being created from these companies is a lot more of the same kind of things. So there's a lot of different consequences that we can see from this consolidation of media companies. This same trend of consolidation is also happening within the news business, with larger organizations and sometimes hedge funds buying up local newspapers and changing their business models, their missions, and in some cases inserting themselves into the types of content that they produce, although we would hope from news outlets that they would not do that. Now, this chart here that I bring up, it illustrates the number of local newspapers, or the shrinking number of local newspapers that are available in different areas of the country. The lighter colors show that there is either no daily newspaper or there's no data to tell us that. And darker colors tell us that there are multiple daily newspapers. And we see that there are some definite gaps in between more rural areas and more urban areas of the countries. What this does is it leaves some areas of the country left with very little local news coverage via newspapers or other print outlets. And as this happens, other information purveyors will take advantage of that gap, and they may try to fill it with information that has other intents and purposes than simply informing the reader. Now, this was highlighted in a recent New York Times investigative story about a single nationwide organization which operated newspapers and websites that were full of favorable content and information for a particular political party or company. And this also happens online. In this case, this same company created these particular kinds of websites that were meant to mimic news sites, but actually were more almost like political ads for a particular candidate or a particular lawmaker. Now, it's here that we get into these issues about the disintermediated landscape, where there are few rules that govern how consumers should know how to differentiate between the different purposes of these different media products. Now, usually we use markers. In traditional broadcast media, there'll be certain markers that help you as a consumer know what you're watching. So first, one of those markers may be a schedule where certain programs run at certain times of the day. So for instance, if you're on the East Coast, if you turn on a broadcast channel at around 6 p.m., you'll know that the evening news might be coming on. Or if you turn on the TV at 8 p.m., again on the East Coast, you'll know that this is prime time, and it's usually entertainment programs that are run at those times. Another marker that broadcast media outlets can use is that they have different channels that can help denote different kinds of programming. So in particular, if you look at something like CNN, they would usually have news or informational programming, while a channel like HGTV would show programs that deal with issues around the home. Now, some of these same structures are also available online through streaming platforms. So streaming platforms like Hulu and Netflix, they provide multiple markers to let viewers make choices of what they watch by highlighting the different genres that programs come from and whatnot. So now let's take a closer look at this idea about disintermediation and get a more precise definition of it. What disintermediated media describes are systems of media creation and distribution that are characterized by direct contact between creators and consumers. These disintermediated systems also have as a characteristic a lack of a human intermediary that can decide whether or not the media being shown to the consumer is of a particular quality or relevance to the audience member. What's important to note here is this human intermediary. I'm really losing these words today. The human intermediary is taken out of this process. Now, the consequences of this are both good and bad, where the good can be that now more voices are part of people's media ecosystems that were not part of them before, because those human intermediaries were gatekeepers, essentially, and said, here's what we let people see and here's what we don't. But also it's let a lot of other purveyors of information, misinformation, and disinformation also enter into lots of people's media ecosystems. So really, when we talk about disintermediation, we mean taking out the middleman. So here's an example from the news media of how this may work. Not the disintermediation, but what mediated media needs to do. So some of the roles in a newsroom, and this picture is showing NPR's newsroom, some of those roles include having reporters, editors, news directors, and so on. And all of these people work together to make decisions on whether or not a piece of content makes it to a website or the screen, or to, in this case for NPR, over the broadcast airwaves. So an example here in NPR's newsroom, any story that you hear will start with a reporter or a producer. So let's say in our case, here's our reporter. So our reporter first gets an idea for a story and then pitches that idea to a assistant or associate producer. And during that pitch, they tell that producer, I think here's a story we might want to follow. Here's what we might want to talk about. And that producer works with the reporter to find out the particular angle of that story they might want to go at, who they might want to talk to, and so on. And then they give them approval to begin that story. Then the reporter goes out and collects all of the elements, does the interviews and so on. And they may work with another producer to help shape that story. And then they work with an engineer to get all of the recorded parts put together. Then once they do so, then that story may then go to a senior editor, and that senior editor chooses what programs or what program will be most appropriate for that story. So in case of NPR, they have a senior editor for Morning Edition and one for All Things Considered, among the other programs. Then that person will say, okay, this story should go in here. And they may also go back to the reporter to say, can you get a little bit more on X? Can we hear a little bit more on this? And then it goes back to the reporter to do that work. So in this case, we have multiple hands touching and shaping a story, where when we hear it as consumers, we may only hear one name in the byline or at the end of that story as the reporter, but many hands help to shape that story. And what we hope from, in particular, like a news outlet, is that they all are working towards informing the audience, that being their intent. This helps to ensure that these stories can be free of errors and so on. On the other hand, online, social media platforms largely allow users to freely post content and share it with users without that human mediated oversight. Now, honestly, this is due to the overwhelming amount of information that's shared on it. So to give you a couple of stats, Instagram reports that it has more than 1 billion active monthly users, and more than half of that billion use it every day. And out of that 500 million daily users, they post some 95 million images on the site every day. On YouTube, it's now estimated that more than 500 hours of video are uploaded to it every minute. So this makes it really, really difficult to put a human in the middle and trying to make decisions on that content. Because if you had one person watch that 500 hours of video, it would take them more than 3 years to get through all of it. So these disintermediated platforms have they've offered benefits by opening up new channels for sharing ideas that were previously ignored by some of these gatekeepers and larger media organizations, and also allowing users to find communities and build communities of people that may have very specific interests. And also that we can now crowdsource information. But on the flip side, they've also led in and been hotbeds for mis and disinformation. So in this case, when we have this disintermediated media, the markers that I talked about earlier, they largely get flattened. So if you see this in these two examples that I show here, where we have two different pieces from Instagram that come from two very different sources. One is a news source, one is not. But when you look at both of them, how would you know? Because those markers again are flattened on these platforms. The only thing we can really use is this little blue check mark here to know whether or not this is coming from a news source. So what can we as consumers do? So one of the ways is becoming more mindful about your consumption of media, more mindful of your media consumption. Now, we've heard of ways to do this. We can use fact checks. We can use checklists of things to do to check out what we're seeing online. Or we can install tools such as NewsGuard here on the right to help tell us how reliable or how reliable the information from a particular website might be. And while it's true that all of these things are helpful, remember, again, engaging with online content sometimes can be like drinking from a fire hose. And in reality, the minute you master one of these tools, you'll probably run into something that will be the exception. So this makes it all the more important for the user to pick up more skills in order to discern credibility on their own. So we have to become much more active about the consumption that we do. So some of the ways to do this is, again, by encouraging mindful media consumption. And what this really means is that users change their mindset and have a greater awareness of what sometimes are called media effects. And this takes some work and some training to do. Some of the things that I hear from lots of my colleagues in the academic space is that it's great that you want people to do these kind of things, but it takes effort to do so. So in order to do so, we have to sort of train ourselves and also practice it regularly. Now, this idea about shifting mindset comes up in a recent study from the journal Nature, where a group of scientists led by Gordon Pennycook, who's a professor of behavioral science and an expert on the decision-making sciences, recently reported that shifting people's behavior towards accurate sharing of accurate information online, the researchers could encourage better sharing behaviors by just doing small shifts or giving them messages that encourage them to do so. Now, this, the authors argue, is because lots of users of social media are frequently driven by other factors to share information. Some of these include alignment with existing political beliefs, humor, or simply outrage. And this is one of many of lots of studies that discuss the need for changing mindsets in relation to tackling misinformation online. And the one that I'm going to show you here is working with news media literacy. And what news media literacy is a strategic collection of concepts that are used to develop skills for more mindful and active media consumption. And what it does in particular, it uses journalism as both a platform for developing skills through the learning of some of these practices, and one for practicing those same skill sets through continual engagement with news content. And the two most prominent providers of this content are the Center for News Literacy and the News Literacy Project. So being that, as we get started, I'm going to use a tool from the Center for News Literacy. I do want to emphasize that no one lesson or tool will automatically make you, a media literate person, but it can get you on the pathway to doing so. So with that, I'll definitely say that it's possible to become more media literate by engaging with a number of different skills and tools. So we'll get started today with this one particular lesson, that of the information neighborhoods. Again, that comes from the Center for News Literacy. And this same lesson, if you've worked with the News Literacy Project, they call these info zones. So what the Center for News Literacy has developed is this taxonomy of information neighborhoods. And for those of you that may have gone on the website and downloaded the slides that I'm going to be using here today, this same taxonomy is on the last page of those slides, if you would like to use this yourself. So what this taxonomy does is it highlights 6 different media genres: journalism, entertainment, advertising, publicity, propaganda, and raw information. And then it breaks them down by 4 different characteristics: the goals, the methods, the practitioners, and the outcome. Now, what we're going to focus on are 2 of those elements, the goals and the outcomes. probably some more on the goals of each of these genres of media. And in each, you can see that there are specific goals that are highlighted with a particular outcome. And it's helpful to think of these as guides to help you understand what the intent of a particular genre of media is. So for instance, we look at entertainment and it's to amuse. If we look at advertising, it's to sell. And you might say, well, this seems pretty obvious, right? But lots of times, again, the lines can get really, really blurry between each of these categories. So it's important for us to keep these in mind when we come upon different pieces of information, even when it may label itself as something else. So here's a primary example that I want to use today. So this comes from a YouTube channel from a gentleman named Brian Tyler Cohen. And in his description here from the top of his YouTube channel, he identifies himself as giving people breaking news every day, no BS. So one would think, oh, this must be a journalist. But let's take a look at one example or video from his channel. And in this, I'm going to have you identify which of these categories or these information, or I should say media genres, it fits into. So we're going to go back to Minty Media again after looking at this video. The other thing I want to tell you in looking at this is that it starts with a clip from Fox News, the Fox News channel, and then goes to Cohen. So I want you to focus specifically on what Cohen brings to this and how that can help us to identify what genre this may fit into.
Yes, because it's just happened now, and I want to double check this with our producers. The DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has resigned, Mr. President.
Well, I'm not surprised. Good. That's a big victory for our country.
Hold on. Let me stop. Let me stop. Let me listen to my team one more time. Forgive me. That has not happened. But and I apologize, listening to the team and you.
Cross off
but
that victory.
I know that you. Right.
This is Fox News' Harris Faulkner just outright lying on air to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of viewers, and claiming the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has resigned before having to walk that back and say that in fact he hasn't resigned. But sure, this is a very, very serious news network.
Okay, so kind of quick clip here. But now what I'm going to have you do is we're going to go back to minty.com. You're going to use the same code. And let me make sure that I go to the next slide here too, so that this comes up for you. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to identify which of the information neighborhoods this video belongs to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to replay it down here as you get a chance to fill these in, and then I'll pull this back up.
Yes, because it's just happened now, and I want to double check this with our producers. The DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has resigned, Mr. President.
Well, I'm not surprised. Good. That's a big victory for our country.
Hold on. Let me stop. Let me stop. Let me listen to my team one more time. Forgive me. That has not happened. But and I apologize, listening to the team and you.
Cross off
but
that victory.
I know that you. Right.
This is Fox News' Harris Faulkner just outright lying on air to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of viewers, and claiming the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has resigned before having to walk that back and say that in fact he hasn't resigned. But sure, this is a very, very serious news network.
All right. So we're getting more responses in to see which of these information neighborhoods this clip belongs to. And one of the things that's always funny about bringing up these examples and when we talk to people about these issues is that I think when we first bring this up, a lot of people think, oh, I just pick one, right? I pick one neighborhood. But actually, this particular example, it bridges some multiple ones, right? And it can have some different kinds of intentions. We think about those intents when we think about which one of these neighborhoods it belongs to. So when we see the results from the 100 people that gave us some responses here, we've got entertainment being one of the most prominent selections, followed by publicity, and then raw information. Okay, so now let's give a take on this. So again, Cohen identifies himself as giving breaking news on his channel. However, as we found towards the end of it, he gives commentary after the Fox News clip that really starts to lean a little bit more into giving us his own point of view without identifying his work as doing so. So we might come to this thinking we're getting news, but we're actually getting a lot of opinion. And also, if we take a look at the description that comes under that video, we see that Cohen has a particular point of view when it comes to talking about our previous president, or also about Fox and so on. So I'd be hard pressed to call this journalism. And as some people identified in the chat, what Cohen is actually doing is something we sort of call infotainment. And Cohen, in doing a little bit of research on who he is, he's actually an actor who it appears to be building a brand on this sort of infotainment. And infotainment is where entertainment and current events sort of collide together. So you can think of programs like Last Week Tonight on HBO, or the monologues that run at the beginning of late night talk shows, such as those with Stephen Colbert and so on. In these cases, the major intent is to entertain instead of to inform. So we might want to be careful if this was our primary source for getting news. It's not to say that those kind of programs are not helpful to us, because they can help us make sense of some of the things that are happening. I watch some of those programs, but it helps for us to be first very well engaged with the news content so we know what this is being based on. So let's take a look at how the Center for News Literacy sort of defines news. So they define news as information of some public interest that's shared and subject to a journalistic process of verification for which an independent individual or organization is directly accountable. And these highlight three particular characteristics that we always want to look out for if something is calling itself news: verification, independence, and accountability. Let's take a look at each of these. First, verification. Verification, the center defines it as the process that establishes or confirms truth or accuracy. So journalists have to collect evidence with the goal of providing the most accurate version of a given event at the moment of publication. So in order to do so, they need to support any claims made in a news story with multiple pieces of evidence. That is what we would hope to see. Now, preferably that evidence should be direct, meaning that it's not hearsay, and that it comes from a primary source with knowledge on what occurred. So how can consumers look for this? What we do is first identify what claim is made in a story, and then see what piece of evidence or pieces of evidence is used to support it. So here's an example. A story from the New York Times last summer talked about a particular doctor, Dr. Desai, who was a scientist who collected data for a study used to support the belief that anti-malarial drugs like hydrochloroquine were dangerous to patients when used as a treatment for the coronavirus. Now, this study was later retracted when other scientists found that they were unable to verify the data supplied by the firm owned by Dr. Desai. So the information here and the claim that's being made is not just that the study was retracted, but also that Desai was a doctor or practitioner who is said to have a history of cutting corners and misrepresenting information in pursuit of his ambitions. So that particular claim is made in the subhead of the story, which comes right under the headline shown here in the image. Then we ask what evidence is used to support that claim. And here, further down in the story, we see while the journal debacle has shaken the broader scientific community, many people who have known Dr. Desai described him as a man in a hurry, a former whiz kid willing to cut corners, misrepresent information, and embellish his credentials as he pursued his ambitions. How did they get that information? in interviews with more than a dozen doctors who worked with him during training and residency, so on and so on and so on. So they showed to us, here are multiple pieces of evidence, and here's how we got it. We call that transparency, in which the reporter will tell you, here's what we know, here's how we know it. So this is really important for us to have in pieces of content that call themselves news. Now let's move to independence. Independence is the freedom from the control or influence of interested parties, coupled with a system of checks and balances to avoid influences of pre-existing beliefs. This is related to something I mentioned earlier, which on a publication level means that there is no particular one person that's pulling the strings of a particular outlet to tell them, here is what you should cover, here's the information you should give. Now, this helps with issues of relative objectivity during the process of reporting. So we want to make sure that we're not having people who have existing beliefs giving us particular pieces of content. So one particular case study that sort of highlights this is a mayor from Utah who was found to be using a false name to write stories about the town that he ran. In this case, we would say that this person was missing independence because this person was self-interested in the outcomes of those stories. We also can look for this on websites. So the website that I brought up earlier, it can be important to look at the content that's on the site. If we take a closer look, we see that while this site mimics a news site, all of the stories have to do with one particular person. In this case, a lawmaker from downstate Illinois. In this case, we would say that this publication is lacking independence. And lastly, accountability. What accountability is being responsible for the information that's shared. We can look for accountability by, when looking at a news story, looking for a byline that highlights who wrote the story. And although I can't show you this here, on the Washington Post website, you could go and roll over these names and get a bio and also find out how these people are connected to the publication. What we also should look for is a date line that tells us when the story was published or when it was edited. And if a mistake was made in the publication of the story, they can issue corrections that highlight if a wrong piece of information was included in the story. They say what that error was and how they corrected it. Again, they are accountable for that information. So these, among other things, are markers, like I talked about before, that can help us as news consumers make decisions on the credibility and the reliability of the outlet publishing information that we can trust. So the big lesson and the big takeaway here is that if a piece of content is labeling itself as news or journalism, that we want to make sure that it has that its information that it brings across is verified, that it is relatively independent, and that it is accountable for the information that it publishes. So again, these takeaways that we can take from this lesson is that information or genres of media can be separated into neighborhoods based on key characteristics, that other forms of media will borrow characteristics of news, creating a blurring of the lines between categories, as we saw an example of that being that infotainment, and that news is characterized with the acronym VINA, verification, independence, accountability. So what are some ways that you can engage with this with some of your patrons? Some ideas include simply creating awareness of these different genres and the issue of blurred lines between categories. So what you can do is you can highlight the differences between these media genres, either by using the information neighborhoods taxonomy or other tools that help your patrons and help others that you are working with highlight the differences between both mediated platforms and disintermediated platforms of information. Again, mediated being broadcast, disintermediated being those online, such as social media. Secondly, we can promote mindful media creation and sharing. So what you can do, one of the ideas here can be to demonstrate the ease with which media can be created and shared online. highlight how a lack of friction, meaning that there are very few hurdles that people have to get over in order to publish information online, and how that can lead to less mindful message sharing. Highlight that when people are upset or sad or scared, it usually does push people to publish and push more information out there or share things that they haven't really thought about very much. And we can engage patrons in the concepts of verification, independence, and accountability, and ask them how they might find these in their own sources of media. So I'm going to leave you with my information here. If you have other questions, I want to make sure to give us about 10 minutes here for some Q&A, but I'll also leave my information here if you have other questions you want to ask for me, and also information from the Center for News Literacy, where you can get to them at the centerfornewsliteracy.org and find out more information about them, or find their resources, further resources, on the Digital Resource Center at digitalresource.center. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Michael. That was excellent. So as he mentioned, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Feel free to type those in the Q&A box. And it looks like we already have one. So Kathleen is wondering what kind of programming you would suggest librarians produce or create to teach or talk about being more media literate.
So programs, so some of the programs one of the things that I would emphasize is because like I mentioned, we worked on the media literacy at your library program together. And in that, I provided training, a full day training to librarians, and then they were tasked with going back and creating programs for their own libraries. And one of the things I would emphasize, because I've gone to a couple of these programs, I would emphasize the use of a particular takeaway that you want people to have when they finish with the program. So as you saw, like in my webinar here, I used this VIA technique, or I used talking about this blurring of the lines. Use that as a framing tool to help your patrons walk away with a particular piece of content. Because in some cases, what can happen is it can be really great for us to talk about issues that come up in media, but if we don't have that very specific takeaway, sometimes your patrons can walk away, and I've had this happen in many of my own workshops. People walk away really happy and they feel like, oh, I learned so much, but then they don't know how to put it into practice, like when they get back. So we want to encourage people to not only learn new information and learn how to discern, but we also want to give them tools that they can take back and use on a regular basis. And this is something I really like about news literacy lessons, because what they do is what they should do is they should encourage people to go back. And when you look at the news, you should be looking at it differently when you walk away from that workshop. So I hope that's helpful.
Great, thanks. And it looks like the next question we have is from Jesse. Do you have any thoughts on news aggregators like All Slides or the media bias charts like the ones produced by Advance Media?
So it's funny to think about those charts. So I will say I'm not a huge fan of them, because none of this stuff is that cut and dry. Like there's no, like, even if like I think it's easy for a person to say, well, I don't trust Fox News, or I don't trust social media because it's all bad, right? But it's not all bad. There are always going to be exceptions to these cut and dry rules. So even the media bias chart, I mean, media bias is sort of like in the eye of the beholder, right? So a person can look at an outlet like Fox News and say, well, they are very right, very Republican leaning. They have a lot of opinion programs on it, and I tend not to trust it. Now, that could be the case for some people, but there's also some news programming that is in the all of the programs that they run. So while, yes, in certain cases, there's a lot of opinion that might be wrapped in a little kernel of truth or a little kernel of news, for some, it can still be helpful. So I think it's more helpful to give people tools for discerning these issues on their own, rather than just painting everything with a broad brush. So one of the last things I'll say is, like, even though you see I use examples from the Washington Post and the New York Times here, I'm very hesitant to tell people, well, this is the place you should go get your news. Yeah, they might be some of the places that I might go, But I also bring that same critical eye when I talk about verification, independence, accountability. I bring that to those outlets as I would to any other outlet of information that I would. And that's what you want to encourage people to do. What that also can do, hopefully, is that it helps with those people that you might encounter that might use some of these sources that you might not find that reliable, but that they like to draw information from. In those cases, it can be really helpful to just walk them through processes of saying, tell me about what it is you believe and tell me how you got there, right? And that allows them to sort of engage in that more mindful consumption. It doesn't mean that they have to be pulled away from Facebook all the time. It just means that they can now become more mindful about what they see there and how they think about it. So I hope that's helpful.
Definitely. Yeah. And then we have a few people wondering who the artist was of the song that you
The
played.
song. So the music that I use, I did see that pop up in the chat. The music I used was actually just some production music that I pulled years ago. So I know it comes from an outlet called Free Play Music that allows and gives production music that people can use with certain licensing requirements. So
Great. And then question that is being upvoted from Sarah is, have you had to mediate arguments that might erupt during these types of discussions, like between people attending your presentations?
So that has actually been something that I really like about, again, the approach to doing news literacy work is that because I've had people come up to me after workshops that I've done and say, well, I like the content, but I didn't really like all the examples, right? And again, that's why I try not to engage in just saying, this is bad, this is good, right? I know that it can sometimes come off that way, especially when I talked about the disintermediated work coming out of social media platforms and mediated being from broadcast. That's not to say that one is better than the other. It's just to say that they use different approaches. So I think by doing that, it can be helpful to, again, engage in this sort of mindful media work instead of just saying, well, all the stuff that comes from, Trump stuff was bad, right? It helps in that case because you don't drive more divisions between all of the people that might be there. You give them, again, tools for engaging in their own sort of mindful media consumption. One of the things that's really interesting in relation to this too, that I was talking with my own advisor about the other day, is that lots of people who we would call conspiracy theorists actually engage in some of the same practices that we encourage people to use here. Now the question becomes, because they feel that they're doing the research and they're going there finding the stuff, then the question becomes, okay, what are these sources? Are these sources independent? Are they verifying that information? How are they doing so? Are they accountable for that information? How so? Again, that allows you to sort of break down, at least to me, I think, and I only have like one or two examples of when this has really, happened, that it can help sort of break down that sort of those demarcations that happen between what people call good information and what people call bad information.
Great. So the next question is from Mindy. So they use NewsGuard on their computers at the library. Do you have any other tools or apps that you would recommend to help patrons put VIA in practice?
To be honest with you, just give them access to more news. So, and encourage them to look for that kind of work, especially in local news outlets. And I would even encourage them to talk back to those local news outlets. So as you can see, I'm very hesitant to say there's one tool that people should use. I think any of them could be helpful, but they have to be buttressed with the information and tools to engage with them. We can't just think of them as being, oh, I installed this program and now everything I see is going to be great, because it's not. So it becomes, so my sort of recommendation there is just to start becoming more mindful and ask the questions of the stuff you see, engage in conversations with people about that content and where they got it from and what it told them and how they knew it.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question, and this is a quick one. So is the information neighborhoods chart under copyright?
It is not. So all of the content that the Center for News Literacy creates is all done. It's all open source. So anyone can use it. All they ask is that you just give credit to them. So it's just like in the same way where I use it in this presentation, any other person can use it. They, you know, you might want to say to the center, hey, I use this in this way that can be helpful for them. But, you know, all you got to do is give credit. Any of the content can be used. It's open source.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So a huge thanks to you for this presentation. And I also want to thank my colleagues behind the scenes, Sarah Osman, Mary Davis Fournier, and Hannah Arata for their support on this webinar. I know that we have some questions still in the chat that we weren't, or the Q&A that we weren't able to get to. If you would like to reach out to either us at publicprograms@ala.org or to Michael, whose email is on the screen, please feel free to do so. This presentation has been offered as part of the Media Literacy Education in Libraries for Adult Audiences project with support from a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The archived version of the session will be available to view on programminglibrarian.org within 48 hours. Thank you to everyone for joining us today and have a good one.